Greetings everyone, I am Dr. J, and welcome to Through the Looking Glass, where I look at old games I haven't played before to see if they hold up. What do you do when you're not sure what game to cover next? Take some advice from Core Design and make more of the same, but hopefully better, with Tomb Raider 2. Subtle jabs aside, this was a game that followed up on what, at the time, was something much different to what people were used to. Having 3D models and camera control which were actually serviceable despite what early 3D graphics were like back then, especially for the PlayStation. Combine that with labyrinthine levels and plenty of secrets to find along the way, and it's no wonder that the franchise did well for itself, until it eventually ran itself into the ground, was rebooted a couple of times, and still managed to limp on, but that's neither here nor there. For me personally, I thought that the original was a perfectly serviceable game, but definitely showed its age when you realized how mechanical a lot of the, well, game mechanics operated. For this one then, my interest was in seeing what kind of changes were made from the original, and whether these changes would work to the game's advantage or not. So without further ado, let's dive into it. Since the story has received even less attention this time around, let's start there. You reprise the role of Lara Croft, as instead of going after the pieces to some ancient thing related to Atlantis, you're going after some ancient Chinese artifact that might involve a dragon. Instead of Natla Technologies getting in your way, this time you have a different evil organization that is also interested in the artifact, which means you get to punch them in the face while you get to run around having a good time all the while. And honestly, that's all there really is to the plot. I mean, there are specific sections that I could fill in the details for, and others where the cinematography's really nice, but outside of that description, the game doesn't throw too many curveballs or unique ideas at you. There is one insane thing they throw at you towards the end, but outside of that, much of it is style over substance, which is supposed to convey a certain tone for the game overall. I think a little more information would have been nice, as to my knowledge there are only 2 or 3 full-on conversations in the entire game, one of which doesn't even involve Lara herself, but if it means we get to spend more time with the gameplay, then I won't raise too much of a fuss. All that I'll say is that we don't learn too much more about Lara Croft as a character, but then again, we don't really get to learn much about the evil corporation either, so it's not as if anyone in particular is getting snubbed. And before someone gets mad at me for sounding dismissive over the lack of a story, for me personally, the story in a game isn't the most important part anyway, save for circumstances where the game makes it a central element. I can appreciate a game like Planescape Torment for its excellent writing while also appreciating a classic FPS for its bombastic action. So while some might not be happy that the story's been scaled down for this game, I'm not going to factor that too much into my final recommendation. Instead, let's move on to things that will factor into that, more specifically the art style, graphics, and overall presentation. I mentioned good cinematography earlier, and given the age of the graphics, the few cutscenes they have work really well. Most of them are done with a seemingly different engine or set of models, but a few of them are also in-game as well, and it doesn't look like scaling the game to 1080p caused any trouble with those in particular. There are some annoying black bars across the out-of-game cutscenes, but given that I was able to find video without that element, I presume that's just a technical problem for either my computer or whatever GOG needed to do to make it functional. The graphics, as I said when I reviewed the first game, obviously show their age, but still work surprisingly well. Even though everything is polygonal, it remains distinct enough to where, from a gameplay standpoint, there's seldom any confusion as to what's what. The models are a little bit improved, especially where Lara is concerned, and the texture work is able to mostly make up for the low polygon count. And before you ask about that comment about Lara Croft, I'm not talking about the obvious part, I clearly mean that she now has a ponytail in-game, which is something the original didn't have. And I'm also fully aware that said obvious part has gone from a 1d6 piercing weapon to a 2d6 bludgeoning weapon, and if I cared about that sort of thing, there is something called the internet.
Don't you think you've seen enough?
Also, that little bit at the end is awesome. Well played, developers. Unnecessary tangent aside, I'm also grateful for the fact that the music and ambience has been improved, in that music doesn't just play in cutscenes and menus, which is really nice. I mentioned in the original Tomb Raider review that much of the music that I used for ambience wasn't in the PC version for reasons unknown, with my working theory at the time being the fact that the PC could save wherever it wanted, while the PlayStation version was constrained to save crystals. Now it seems that my theory was largely correct, as the music doesn't play when you go underwater or into a menu, but at least the technology is there for music to play in-game now, even if it is jarring for it to go away in those circumstances. I kind of wish it played more often, but it does stand out more because it's used sparingly, so credit where it's due in that regard. Some of the ambience is still a little annoying, including some parts where it seems to be actively messing with you, but at least some of it gets substituted for music now, so I'm going to consider the improvements here largely welcome. As for the gameplay, this is where my jab at being more of the same really comes into play, as while that's the case for almost everything, the gameplay is what we're spending the most time interacting with, and it hasn't changed all that much. To give a quick primer for newcomers, The game uses tank controls, meaning that the front and back buttons work as you would expect, but instead of moving to the side when you press the side buttons, Lara will instead turn in that direction. In order to make everything work properly besides that, the game uses very mechanical platforming controls. Each platform can be broken up into at least a 4x4 grid, with walking taking up 1 space, running taking up 2, and backing up taking 4. There can be some variance for vertical height, but for horizontal surfaces, that holds true for everything you can jump on. As with any platformer, your goal is to make it from beginning to end in one piece, which in this case means using fancy acrobatics. Where you stand, whether you're moving already, and what direction on the arrow keys or D-pad you're pressing will affect where and how far she jumps. You can also use an action button to grab onto and climb up ledges, regardless of whether you're jumping or walking up to them. Some areas will also have places that you can climb on, which will mean holding the action button and using the arrow keys or D-pad like you would expect. When these places don't allow you to climb up, you can still hang off of ledges and move around on them to reach a better vantage point. The only other important part of the platforming involves swimming, where on the surface you move around as normal. But when you hold down the action button, you swim underwater using the arrow keys to control your direction. That should cover the platforming, and if that's a lot to take in, I go through this more slowly in my first Tomb Raider review. And given how the game starts out, it might be better to begin with that one anyway. From now on, I'm going to assume that you're either coming from that review, or you already understand how it works, and are curious to hear what a newcomer has to say. So, let's get on with it. On its own, if this system were purely used for platforming, I would probably hate it. Especially since I had already seen a fair amount of this system in the original, playing through 20 hours more of it would have gotten old really quickly. Fortunately, the game didn't fully rely on that, but instead forced you to think more carefully about each section. The level design was really well done, as while it was obtuse in places, it was laid out in a more sensible manner, at least where gameplay was concerned. Some of the levels acted like a more narrow pathway, while a lot of them relied on a bunch of interconnected pathways. That might seem like a bad idea at first, since that means you'll be backtracking someone, but as a way to ground the player and to help orient them, especially when there's no map, it works fairly well. It also means a fair number of the places you need to go are already in sight, and you get a visual indicator of how far you've come as you're playing the level. Where this doesn't work so well for me is the pacing, which I felt was really off this time around. I had some problems with the pacing in the original, specifically with the final 2 levels, but this time the pacing issues shifted from there to the rest of the game. It's not that there isn't a lot to do, but more to do with the fact that a lot of the levels feel like they last forever. I can understand giving the player more to chew on since this is a sequel where we presumably played the first one, but when one spends literally 2 hours on level 4, I start to think there might be a problem. Admittedly, not all of the levels are that long, with most of them taking about an hour to complete, but while that might not sound too bad, it felt longer because the underlying tasks you're doing throughout are largely the same. The game tries to justify this by giving you plenty of interesting locales and a significant amount of puzzle solving, but it doesn't feel like enough. Most of the puzzles boil down to looking for an object to put somewhere, exploring a path that just opened up, figuring out how to get past a series of traps or pitfalls, and going through a checklist to see what you can do to move forward. There are also secrets to find, specifically 3 per level, but even then there aren't many because they're thematically keeping it constrained to 3 colored dragon statues. However, some may ask why I'm talking about repetition now when there are a couple of other things to consider. To start, there are a couple of points where you control vehicles, which are definitely a welcome change of pace. The levels involving the boat were interesting because it allowed us to get around faster, which meant they were able to do a nice little time trial in one section. The level involving the snowmobile was also nice, if only for the satisfaction of running over bad guys with it, and because it felt awesome. The music that accompanied it sounded a little out of place in the game, but since it was so different from anything else, I can spin that into a positive without too much thought. When those elements were present, I didn't have too many problems. Where I really had a problem was with the combat, as I didn't like it in the first game, and I like it even less here. For the uninitiated, there's a button that allows you to switch between a platforming mode into a combat mode, where Lara takes either twin sidearms or something a little more menacing from her back, so that you can shoot unfriendly people in the face. Before, I could sort of understand the appeal of the combat because you were primarily fighting animals, which meant you at least could do interesting acrobatics to keep them at arm's length. Fighting human opponents though wasn't all that fun, because it involved resource management rather than any ability to play effectively. The choice wasn't a matter of how to avoid taking fire, it was a choice of whether you wanted to chew through more powerful ammo versus your health packs, both of which were in fairly high supply for better or worse. Here though, they curbed your ability to stockpile ammunition and health packs a little bit, even if I still had a large-ish stockpile by the final boss fight, but now you're fighting against a lot more people with firearms. So now, the part of the game's combat that I find to be the most uninteresting is now the most prevalent aspect, which honestly was not well thought out. The only real change made was to the number and type of weapons you have access to, and while the assault rifle is fun to shoot, it's virtually identical to the Uzis, only you don't seem able to jump around like a drunk rabbit while using it. At least you can do that with the grenade launcher, which is probably the best new addition to the combat, since you don't get to use it all that often. And the time travel on the grenades means you have to think carefully before shooting. Since the game auto-aims so long as Lara is facing her opponent, it might not matter so much in that regard, but at least most enemies have the courtesy of either standing still or running straight for you. Some of them can be dealt with from a distance by climbing up on something they can't follow you to, because even though you can safely use your default pistols from there, apparently they don't always get the hint to run away from the woman shooting at them. And don't even get me started on the harpoon. You get so little ammo for that, and it's so finicky to control properly that whoever thought it was a good idea to have underwater shooting sections needs to be met in kind. So, with what I've been talking about in the past few minutes, I think most people would get the impression that I don't like this game, which is partially true. If I weren't reviewing it, I don't know if I would have finished it, but when I actually sat down to start, I'd be lying if I said it weren't entertaining for what it is. The pacing might have been off, but since I tend to play level to level, part of the blame could fall on me for needing to have the Skinner box reward me with an end level screen. It might be repetitive, but when there were large sections without any combat, it was almost therapeutic to slowly keep making progress. The platforming didn't change up a whole lot, but there were nice ideas like the boat and snowmobile sections, as well as a springboard that was introduced in later levels, which drastically changed how you interacted with said sections. On the whole, it's more of the same, but by that same token, it's more of the same. So in the end, this might be the easiest recommendation that I'll ever make. For me personally, it was a little too tedious for my liking, as while I can live with repetitive gameplay, this wasn't the kind of repetitive that I found compelling. Perhaps it's because I've grown used to Dota-style and Diablo-style games, but I at least like to have more of an illusion of variety for me to enjoy something repetitive, which both genres are better at than this game. As to everyone else, whether you think it's worth buying or not will largely depend on what you thought of the first game. If you liked it, then you might find the problems I mentioned to be annoying, but you'll probably still enjoy the improvements that are there, and I think you'll have a fun time. If you don't like the first one, then this isn't going to be the one to convince you. If you haven't played the first one, then I would strongly suggest researching the first game, well, first. As while it's very similar to its descendants, it's much easier to get into for a newcomer. Fortunately, if you end up liking it, the GOG version has the first 3 Tomb Raider games bundled together, so whether or not that's a good deal, I'll leave up to you. However, bear in mind that if you're using Windows 10, you're going to have a bad time getting this to work even if you get the GOG version. The reason I know this is because I was using Windows 10 when I reviewed the first game, and when I tried to play the second after that review had been published, I saw the application taking up CPU and memory but not showing anything and eventually closing itself. The reason why I was able to play it for this review was because I swapped out my motherboard and graphics card in between now and then, which meant I was relegated back to Windows 7, which worked like a charm up to and including scaling to 1080p. So, if you have Windows 10, then just bear in mind that you're going to run into difficulties, as based on what I saw on the GOG forums, this doesn't seem like an isolated incident. Either way, that's all I have for this video. Thank you all for watching. Please like and share this if you find it deserving, and subscribe to this channel for the next game in Through the Looking Glass, as well as other content posted on a not-so-regular basis. So, given what I had to say about this game, I do own Tomb Raider 3, but I think I'm gonna give it some distance before I dive back in. I like to try and keep up a variety of content on this channel, which will hopefully mean a couple of fairly different games coming in the next 2 reviews. So, to ensure that I'll have time to pick those games apart, I better get back to work on them, and we'll see you all later.